Hi guys, this is the second in a series of videos that I'm doing on gastrointestinal parasites. So the video I just completed was Entamoeba histolytica, which is actually a fairly common cause of amoebiasis. Not so much in the United States, but in tropical and subtropical regions. We're now actually going to move on to Giardia. Giardia actually is a really common cause of infection in the United States. Giardia is also an amoeba, so we're going to stick to those two life cycle forms of trophozoite and cyst found in fecal specimens. And part of the reason I like to talk about Giardia is that it's a really common pathogen amongst one specific place: water parks. Water parks and splash pads. As a microbiologist, I actually see it as my job to ruin all things fun for you. And so today we're going to ruin water parks. Okay, so let's talk about the organism itself first. The Giardia organism is a flagellate. It also has a cyst and trophozoite stage. So you can see here, this is our trophozoite stage in A, and this is our encysted stage in B. The organism moves using its flagella, and the disease produced by the flagellates are typically due to mechanical irritation and inflammation. So basically, as that flagella whips around, it's irritating. Giardia duodenalis actually refers to one organism that has three names, okay? So there's Giardia duodenalis, Giardia lamblia, and Giardia intestinalis. I'll pretty much just say Giardia or Giardia duodenalis, but other sources may use the other names, which is why I've mentioned them here. So how are we going to diagnose it? You can look for either the trophozoite or the cyst form in fecal specimens of the infected patient. The infective form, though, is the cyst, just like we talked about in other organisms. The cysts are released in the stool and then are picked up and ingested by the next person. So where do we find this? Giardia has a worldwide distribution. It's present in streams, lakes, and mountain resorts. It also has kind of a sylvatic distribution, its own sylvatic life cycle that is maintained in wildlife that drinks from these sources. So, you know, if you're in a mountain resort and you see a deer drinking from a stream and think, oh, what a beautiful picture, I look at it and say, I bet you that deer's getting Giardia. So drinking inadequately treated contaminated water or unclean fruits and vegetables, eating unclean fruits or vegetables. So you're walking through, I don't know, a banana grove and you pull a banana off the branch and eat it and are reveling in how fresh it tastes. Might have Giardia. I don't know. I'm not certain if bananas get Giardia. Vegetables, that's another likely route of infection if you're not cleaning your fruits and vegetables. The disease is spread through the fecal oral or oral anal route. And the reason I call this the disease of water parks and splash parks is because this actually is a particular concern for daycare centers, other institutional centers, and areas of recycled water. So I live in Chicago. In Chicago, we have this amazing park, Millennium Park. Okay, and if you go to Millennium Park in the summer, there's all sorts of different splash pads. There's actually this really cool one on Michigan Avenue where it's all stone, and then there's these giant pillars and they have faces on them, and it looks like the faces are like spitting water out, and which sounds strange, but it's actually really beautiful. And on a hot summer day, if you're walking on Michigan Avenue, you will see at least one child. And this child is running gleefully through this splash pad with their mouth wide open, just going, ah, having so much fun. This child is also wearing a diaper. Yep, that's the problem. They're all wearing diapers. Not all of them. I mean, some of them age out. But the ones that are wearing diapers, they are a hotbed of disease. Why? Because those diapers get wet. And when they get wet, they sag. And when they sag, fecal material comes out. And it contaminates the water supply for this splash pad. And I don't know if Chicago, what they do about this. I'm not trying to down on Millennium Park. I actually love Millennium Park. But most splash pads do not treat the water between recycling. right? So that same recycled water comes back out again. And then another child runs gleefully, mouth wide open, and that fecal material goes right in. And that, my friends, is a way that you can recycle Giardia through a splash pad over and over and over, just infecting children. And then they go to their daycare centers and they don't wash their hands and they continue to infect children. So that, my friends, is why you should never play in a splash pad. Although I let my kid play in the splash pad all the time. Okay, so now that we know kind of how we get it, what actually happens? Well, first off, the patient has to ingest between 10 to 25 cysts. The cysts are then degraded in the gastrointestinal tract, and that gastric acid leads to the release or the release of the trophozoites from the cyst. That release actually occurs in the duodenum and jejunum, and they're going to multiply massively by binary fission. Now, here's where it gets interesting. These two little things, let me see if I can find a good way to draw them. These are little vacuum suckers, and they kind of suck. They are ventral sucking discs, and they suck onto the intestinal villi, and they just hang out there, just holding on for dear life with these ventral suckers. And these flagellates over here are just whipping around. So it's literally like a vacuum. If instead of you pushing it, it had flagella that moved like giant fan boats, pushing the vacuum around the living room that is your intestinal villi. Okay, so what's the clinical syndrome? So thankfully, approximately 50% of individuals are asymptomatic, no problem. But if they do contract giardiasis, it can range from a mild diarrhea to a severe malabsorption syndrome. Just kind of depends. The incubation period for the disease ranges from anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. Now, remember, parasites can take a little while to grow. So this isn't like a food poisoning where you ingested it yesterday and you're sick today. It's going to be at least 7 days. The average time period is about 10 days. You're going to get onset of disease with a sudden, foul-smelling, watery diarrhea. And that's going to be associated with abdominal cramps, flatulence, steatorrhea, and you're going to want to look at kind of the quality of the stool. That'll help in identifying your organism. So in this case with Giardia, it's really not invasive. So you're unlikely to see blood and pus. Typically, most patients spontaneously recover within 10 to 14 days, but that's a pretty long period of time. I mean, think about the last time you had like noro or enero or rota. You know, you were sick for 3 or 4 days and probably felt terrible. So we're talking 2 weeks of gastrointestinal upset. Now, here's where we have to be more concerned. That's considered a pretty mild case of giardiasis, but there are patients who develop severe giardiasis, and that's severe malabsorption syndrome. This occurs in patients with intestinal diverticula, and they may develop more severe disease. In this case, the tips of the villi may appear flattened, and you see chronic active inflammation of the mucosa with hyperplasia of lymphoid follicles observed. And in this case, you can also see necrosis and spread beyond the gastrointestinal tract, but that's pretty rare. How are we going to diagnose it? Well, thankfully, there's actually a lot of ways to do that, which makes sense because when you've had gastrointestinal distress for more than probably about 3 or 4 days, you're not typically waiting at home for it to go away. Most of the time, you're probably going to start going to see a doctor because that's abnormal. That's not just run-of-the-mill food poisoning. So there are some options. There are fecal antigen tests using like ELISA strategies or immunofluorescence staining. You can also examine the stool specimens for cysts and trophozoites. Basically, what happens is that you get kind of excretion of organisms in showers. So what do I mean by that? You'll get many organisms in a specimen one day and then none the next. This likely has to do with the way the organisms are making their way through the life cycle. Therefore, you might see a lot of false negatives. So what you need to do is serial stool specimen collection, okay? So if you get a negative one day, check the next day. and then check the day after that. If over the course of 3 or 4 days you haven't gotten a shower of Giardia, then it's likely not Giardia. Okay, and then identification of trophozoites in the duodenal biopsy. That would obviously be kind of like, you know, the most extreme approach to diagnosis, but that is a way that you could go ahead and diagnose it. Okay, how are we going to get rid of it? If we contract it, again, I largely leave this to pharm, but from what I can find on it, metronidazole is kind of your treatment of choice. And how do we prevent it? First off, go near places of clean water. Like, don't swim in sketchy areas. Don't, you know, keep your mouth open where you think the water might be contaminated. If you're going to play on splash pads, then, you know, try to keep your mouth closed. But the other thing that we didn't really talk about is pets. You want to make sure your pets drink clean water too. So I have a dog. I take him to the dog park all the time. He's constantly trying to find stagnant, gross water to drink, and I'm constantly yanking him away from it. Why? Because he lives in my house. If he contracts Giardia, it makes me and my family more susceptible to it as well. So we want to make sure our pets are also drinking from clean water sources whenever possible.